All right, very good. All right, so welcome to the April meeting of the PRC. We have a couple of regrets, so one from Rob and one from John, and there's an iPhone waiting to enter. Okay, we have iPhone on the screen. Who is iPhone? Oh, okay.
Hi. How are you?
Good, good. How are you? Good, thank you.
Good, thank you.
Yes. All right, guys. So circulated the agenda on Friday, so hopefully everybody's had a chance to take a look at it. So can I have a motion to adopt the agenda as circulated? Howard, thank you. And a seconder? Very good. Okay, all in favor? Thank you. Likewise, we circulated the minutes of the meeting of March 14th. I think it was yesterday. So thank you, Peter, for preparing those. Can I have a motion then to accept the minutes? And a seconder? Howard, oh, Howard, yes. You're muted, Howard.
My wife says she wished I was muted all the time, but there's one small correction I need to suggest for the minutes, and I'm honestly just trying to find my copy of the minutes. It's Peter, I understand completely how difficult it is to catch everything on the minutes. We were talking about, I had raised the issue about the Law Commission. So under news and announcements, the second paragraph, Howard B. mentions the federal government has announced the revival of the Law Commission of Canada. Reference to this was in the CCJ newsletter 3 issues ago. President and 2 commissioners named do not have a strong legal round bracket law background. I just wanted to correct that. I may have not spoken clearly, but they all 3 of them have good law backgrounds. None of them appear to have good criminal law experience. So again, the point is, they're all, one is a professor at McGill. They all have significant legal background. Just none of them appear to have a criminal law background, which again is another indication of the government's intent to move the Law Commission away from criminal justice issues to legal issues more broadly. Anyway, I didn't want to be accused of jokingly, I will say defame, but misrepresenting the qualifications of the 3 commissioners. So thanks, I would just change that. Does not have a strong criminal law background.
Okay, so Peter, if you would correct that, all those in favor of the minutes as amended, and I will, Peter, if you send that to me, I will recirculate it to the PRC. So thank you.
Small thing, but I just wouldn't want anyone to think that we're misstating.
No, perfectly fine. Thank you, Howard. Okay, for now going back to news and announcements. So we have we talked about this last day, the note from Peter with respect to the Alberta government attempting to institute the APS. Peter, you were working on a brief. How's that going?
Yep. It's a work in progress, and of adding in at the end to bookend it the mass casualty report out of Nova Scotia, because there's points in there that should be added in. Pardon me?
I was just saying I'm having some trouble hearing you. It's kind of cutting in and out. Is that the same for everybody?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, just to let you know, Peter. So
I'm going to turn off my video to see if that helps.
The sound seems to be better, although we miss seeing you. But okay. Thanks, Peter. Okay. Next is the Justice Canada study on differential court outcomes. Brendan, I think you were going to do this last meeting, but you came in a little late, so we put it over till today. So you were preparing a report. So how was that?
Yeah, so I haven't prepared like a report per se. I would be more than happy to if that's what the PRC would like. I actually I have maybe about a 4 or 5 minute presentation I put together just to outline sort of my thoughts and concerns about the report. If that's
fine, sure.
All right. Like I said, I'd be more than happy to put it more in written form if that would be helpful. I could do it a little more thoroughly and all that. The report's entitled Black People in Criminal Courts in Canada, an exploration using the relative rate index. It's a very important issue, of course. It's something that the PRC and the CCJ has been looking for, to have disaggregated race-based data with Statistics Canada. It actually uses a really, really cool tool. It's called it's a Statistics Canada tool. It's called the SDLE. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with it. It stands for Social Data Linkage Environment. And so what that is, it's like a secure area where it allows for the tracking of individuals between surveys and other administrative data, like we use for justice and corrections data. So what they did in this case specifically was they connected numbers that anonymized essentially people in the justice databases and connected that to census respondents, because census is everyone. So we know at least we know how many people of different ethnic origins or races, or whatever term we prefer to use. I apologize, I'm losing it right now, but we have all that data in the sense, and what they did is they linked that. So that's really cool. Actually, it's a project I've personally been trying to promote, because we can actually follow somebody through the trajectory of the criminal justice system. We just need to work at linking it. So I was really, really excited when I saw this project. It unfortunately though, it uses an interesting tool, the relative risk rate index, sorry, to estimate how overrepresented Black people in Canada are based on their prevalence in larger Canadian society compared to the prevalence at various stages of the criminal justice system. So essentially what this report is doing is comparing rates of people in society versus rates at different stages, and making a ratio of those to come up with a singular number that can be used to judge if there's overrepresentation, underrepresentation, or roughly similar representation between Black people and white people in the criminal justice system. And I use Black people in this case because that's what they use in the report, so I'll just use their terminology. According to the report, the key findings were that Black people are overrepresented as accused in the criminal justice system, more likely to encounter a withdrawal, dismissal, or discharge, less likely to encounter a stay or be found guilty, which includes guilty pleas. They're equally likely to be acquitted, less likely to receive a fine or conditional sentence, more likely to receive probation or a custodial sentence, and more likely to receive long custodial sentences of 2 years or more. Obviously, some of these findings are concerning. I don't think that's really unexpected, and they will certainly negatively impact Black people in Canada and those that are involved in the criminal justice system. And so while this study is certainly useful to a degree, I have several concerns with the methods and the conclusions that are made. In my mind, some of these concerns are so large that they could have, I think some of the issues with this report are so large that theoretically we could have received completely different results. Either the disparity could have been even larger, or we could have seen opposite results because of these, because of my concerns. So I urge others to read the report, of course, but to be cautious and take the findings with a grain of salt. So my first concern, and I'll just go over three, so is the inability to control for offense and criminal history in this report. They essentially just took two rates, the amount of Black people in a certain stage compared to white people, and they just sort of took it at the stage. They didn't control for how these variables play for these different rates. So we know that, for example, offense and criminal history play an enormous role in sentencing. I personally have worked with this data set, not linked with race data, unfortunately, but I have worked with ICCS microdata, and I found that adding either of those two variables changed relationship types, the size, and it was nowhere near the same story when I looked at it, when I added those variables. So just taking a really quick example, we know that people of color are disproportionately impacted by mandatory minimum penalties, particularly surrounding firearms, hence recent legislation like Bill C-5. So for this case, it's not especially surprising that Black defendants are less likely to receive fines because the offenses where that they are getting charged with more often are ones that cannot have a fine because the minimum sentence is higher. So that's just kind of the idea, the reason why I think it's really important to take into account offense type and why some of these differences might exist and might actually disappear or worsen or improve depending on the offense type. My second concern is that it's a completely descriptive methodology. So they're not using any like sort of inferential statistics to try and model the relationships, which would allow them to take into account a variety of variables to better estimate the relationships. It would have allowed I'll just I know that there are several models or combinations of models that could have accomplished this goal, and I'm a little disappointed that they didn't try to use some of those models. But I think I know a little bit why, and I'll go into that very shortly. One of my last concerns, though, is that I feel that some of the point that in the final discussion of this report, if anyone's had the chance to look at it, I feel that points suggesting either more favorable or equally favorable outcomes for Black defendants are not highlighted as much as those which suggest less favorable treatment. Of course, when there's less favorable treatment of Black defendants, of course, that's incredibly important, and we need to draw attention to that. But I find that the authors really skim over those. For example, the fact that there's an equal likelihood of acquittal, I find that quite reassuring, and I think there's a story to tell there. And I think that those nuances are glossed over a little bit. I won't go into too much more detail because I don't want to take too much more time. I can give more, if anyone has more specific questions, I'll go into it. But in sum, I find the conclusions to be a bit strong for what the data permits. The authors do note some of the weaknesses, like not being able to take into account offense type. However, they don't discuss how they believe the results could change should these weaknesses be overcome. And by not doing this, I don't think they're providing readers with enough information to evaluate the strength of their arguments. My primary concern is that these results are intuitive, they're easy to interpret, and it's likely that these data will be taken up by media and others to point to systemic racism in the criminal justice system. This discrimination undoubtedly exists. I don't think that's really a shock, but providing weak answers to a problem this immense runs the risk of feeding into the wrong solutions, and so that is really my concern. So I believe this report's still a useful addition to scholarship in Canada's criminal courts. It's certainly still worth reading. Its attempt to fill a significant gap in our understanding is commendable. However, I believe its significant weaknesses need to be better highlighted for readers to judge just how far to trust these findings. That's about it. So I would love, if anyone has any questions, I'd be more than happy to address them.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Brendan. That was really good. Great analysis. I'm concerned about the issues that you've raised with respect to your concerns on the report. I don't know whether there's an opportunity to, mold that into a brief and then forward it to the authors of the study.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether there's that opportunity exists, or if it's just we're accepting the report and their study as received and leaving it at that. So, anybody else may have a point on that. Howard.
Just Brendan and I have talked about this, and I commend Brendan for his excellent analysis of this report. When I read it, I had the same reaction to some of their conclusions. They seem to softball some that focus on equality or equal treatment, and they tend to focus more on the ones that don't. But overall, I would support your idea, Miles, of a brief or even simply a letter to Stats Canada. But I think what's important to put in terms of context is something Brendan and I have talked about. This report shows a tendency from Stats Canada for the first time in my career to do more thoughtful, broad, focused kinds of reports. One of the most commendable things about this report is it focuses for almost the first time on key decision points in the criminal court process. Stats Canada traditionally has been all over corrections data because lots available from Correctional Service of Canada and other things, but they have been much weaker on reporting on an analysis of what they call in the report key stages, decision points of the criminal court process, things like decisions to withdraw, dismiss, or discharge, a stay of proceedings, acquittal or conviction. Sentencing data has been traditionally a little more available, but even here they're making some inroads in terms of fine versus other community sanctions versus imprisonment. So one of the things I'd like us to say to them is that we think this report is a great first step that there are what we perceive to be weaknesses that could be exploited by a media that may have an interest in sensation. Obviously, I'm being careful with my words, but I think Brendan and I are exactly on the same page. But I think it would be important not to miss the point that they are starting to produce over the last year. I just saw another one today about housing conditions for women in Canadian society that has all sorts of interesting perspectives on how women are disadvantaged economically and with respect to housing. And I mean, they're starting to do some really thoughtful pieces. They're not perfect. This analysis needs a little more direct, straightforward honesty, just exactly as Brendan has said. And Brendan's an expert and knows much more than I do on the methodology. But I think it would be right to write to them, even just a letter saying, we encourage this. We see this as a trend, and more thoughtful, useful reports that dive down into the weeds, as the expression goes, but more disaggregated data, but also focusing on decision points that haven't been covered, and the ability to link data, as Brendan was saying, through their various data collection processes this is leaps and bounds ahead of where they've been. So I'm sorry, a long intervention, Brendan. I know you and I've talked about this and we agree. We want to encourage them to do more of the same, maybe to do it a little bit more brutally honest, to use an expression. But Brendan, anything, does that make sense?
Yeah, I'd be more than happy to write something up. Yeah, I would be more than happy to do that. I don't. Sorry, go ahead.
No, see, that's great. That'd be great. I mean, and what we would do is receive it. I don't think timing is an issue, so we could receive it, look at it if it's ready for at our next meeting, and then approve it and send it on to the board, because the letter would come from the board, I would think, as fast as can.
Yeah, and so I would note this report is actually, like, it was done in with the aid of StatCan, but it was actually the Research and Justice Statistics Division at Department of Justice.
Sure. Well, yeah, whoever should go to that's fine.
I'm not sure. Like, I can try to have something put together for next meeting. I can't guarantee it. It's a bit of a busy time, but I'll do what I can to get it ready before next meeting.
Yeah, whatever you can do, Brendan, it'd be appreciated. That's terrific.
Sure. Anything else? That's a good point about the letter, not just to Stats Canada, but also Justice Canada, and maybe Public Safety Canada as well, because I think they're all contributing to analysis on this data.
Super. All right. Well, thank you very much, Brendan. Howard, thank you. Next, I'm adding an issue to the news and announcements. It deals with items in the federal budget, the 2023 budget of a couple of weeks ago. Howard kindly sent me an email yesterday, I guess it was, regarding this, with some page references in the budget dealing with issues that deal with criminal law and criminal justice. So I can just go through them, in the order that they're presented in the budget itself. The first one, which is referenced at page 36 in the budget document, deals with cracking down on predatory lending, right? And that deals, of course, with what are exorbitant rates of interest, high interest loans that are made available to Canadians. The rate is not supposed to be any higher than 47%. Above that, it becomes usurious, and there's a statute called the Usurious Lending Act out there. But I mean, many loans are far higher than that, and if you extrapolate them out, compound them over a year, they're hundreds and hundreds of percent interest rate. So the purpose of this item of the budget was to basically ensure that loans don't rise above a approved lending rate of 35%. So we'll see how that happens, how that goes into effect. To a great degree, they didn't. The centerpiece of this kind of loan lending procedures are payday loans, and the budget didn't do anything in real terms to address payday loans, other than simply say that the lenders aren't to charge more than $14 per $100 borrowed. In Ontario, the current rate is $15, so that doesn't make a lot of change there. But that's I don't know what in fact they're going to do on a specific basis to each lender. You know, I don't see any timing in this part of the budget saying when the rates are going to take effect or how they're going to take effect and how they're going to be imposed, what penalties may well be imposed upon lenders that don't pay attention to that. Howard, do you know anything more about this than?
No, Miles, I think you've covered it very fully. I just, one of the points of interest was this is a criminal code amendment in a budget act or a budget process, which raises all sorts of issues about transparency. But you're right. I mean, they're usurious loans. I mean, their title is quite descriptive. Predatory. What do they call it? Predatory lending. Anyway, but no, I think you've covered it fully. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, the next issue is the combating the opioid crisis. So the provision of the budget bill that deals with obviously the dramatic and significant amount of life that's lost to opioid consumption and overdoses for the most part. 20 Canadians per day lose their life as a function of this, which is an astronomical number. Currently the government has been focusing on harm reduction, and obviously that's a very smart way to approach it. And what the budget is proposing is to provide a total of just under $360 million over the next couple of years, again going to what's called the Canadian Drugs and Substances Strategy, which is directed at harm reduction. So that's obviously beneficial. The third issue is addressing wrongful convictions. That, of course, goes back to all our efforts, and now the introduction of Bill C-40 to create a miscarriage of justice commission. And what this part of the budget does is it proposes to provide $83.9 million over 5 years, starting this year, and $18.7 million ongoing to Justice Canada for the commission. Most of that, it's a good, I'm thinking about it. I mean, there's going to be obviously an infrastructure put in place for the commission. There's going to be anywhere between 6 and 8 commissioners, a combination of full-time and part-time. The commissioner is going to be paid the same rate as a Superior Court justice appointment is. I'm not sure what that is these days. I know Ontario Court of Justice get $340,000. I don't know what Superior Court judges get at the federal level. I presume it's more than that. But in any event, of that budget, $2 to $3 million are salaries for the commissioners, and then again the infrastructure for the staff, and then I presume a lot of budget is towards the investigative part of that process, which is there on behalf of those who apply. So we'll see, but it's nice to see, because that's a decent budget for this, and obviously somebody in the background has put those numbers together based upon whatever information they got from, I would think, Kent Roach and the committee with Harry Laforme to basically say this is what we'll need to bring this into effect. So that's obviously a good thing. And we also have provisions in the budget dealing with money laundering and terrorist financing, and Bill C-41, which we mentioned the last day, which is a response to the Senate Human Rights Committee, basically saying that there has to be some way to allow for funding to go to countries, fundamentally Afghanistan, where terrorist funding cannot interfere with or shouldn't criminalize charitable work, done by the Red Cross and what have you in those countries as well. So that's what I took out of the budget. Anything else, Howard, you saw in the budget you want to mention?
Just again, I mean, one of the issues for me has always been when I was with Justice, and for decades, there was a convention that criminal law matters would not go into a budget because the criminal law matter ought to have a much higher visibility when introduced. C-41 has been introduced, and so that's had its own track. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but I'm just for many years I just ignored the budget, assuming it was money stuff and not. But even a simple word search of the budget document starts to reveal a lot of criminal law matters. One of the things I found quite interesting, for instance, because I hadn't heard of it before, is that they're creating a new Canadian Financial Crimes Agency, CFCA, under Public Safety Canada. So there's a whole new agency dealing with financial crimes, which, as we know, can be quite broad in terms of defrauding even old people like me of our life savings, and stuff like that. So, I mean, there's sort of important stuff here. I wondered, Miles, just for everyone's benefit, I could copy into the chat just the quick page references so people can take a look at it. Would that be helpful?
Sure, that'd be great.
So I'm going to just copy it into the chat, or at least try to. Actually, I thought I could copy it into the chat. I'll play with that a little bit. So watch the chat thing. You may see if it's there, you can just copy it out of there. But it's just a series of about 5 items and a reference to the budget document. They have not yet, as far as I can tell, introduced the Budget Implementation Act, which will give us further details. But at any rate, stay tuned for that. It just it appears that governments are using different sort of mechanisms to advance criminal justice policy matters, different than they had before. Yeah, I can't seem to. Anyway, I let me keep playing with it. If I can, I'll copy it into the chat. So.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Eric. Okay, moving on to business arising. So now we're dealing with the justice-related committees. So before, Howard, you work on that, we have the Commons, Justice, and Human Rights Committee.
Yes, it's just Andrea, I think, was trying to jump in.
Yeah. Thanks, Howard. Just quickly, just drawing on your point there, Howard, I think it's interesting how the last 2 budgets have really pushed the limit on what's traditionally in a budget. This is the first time that I've seen in this particular budget, and unless you were knowledgeable about the project, you wouldn't even know that it was corrections based. But there's a note in the budget about accelerating the construction of a CSC correctional facility as well. And so I just wanted to point that out as well, as it's not criminal law, yes, but they're also sneaking other things in there. So it was important to do a detailed read of the budget. And so I wanted to point that out as well, because I've never seen that type of language go into a budget before about, from a minister pushing CFC to build a facility faster.
Great, thank you, Andrew.
Andrew, I must say, when I use criminal, I mean broad, all corrections, policing, all of it. But it's something we all need to keep our eye on. Just to, it's an extremely good point. These are important issues of public policy. And I got it into the chat, so anyone who goes onto the chat should be able to just copy it right out of there. There's the budget document and the page references to the 5 items that I could see. Andrea, obviously, you've located another one on the corrections that didn't come up in my word search, but it's something to be cognizant of. So,
very good.
It's on page 60.
Good. Okay, Howard, Commons.
Yes. I'm just flipping through my various screens here. So there have been 4 meetings of this committee since our last PRC meeting. Those meetings were on the 20th, 22nd, 27th, and 29th of March. The House, of course, was not sitting last week or this week, but returns next week. And so that's why there haven't been any meetings since March 29. All 4 meetings that have occurred focused on Canada's bail system. The most recent meeting was on March 29, which also dealt with committee business, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But I just to remind everyone that the Standing Committee at its meeting of January 30th decided to undertake what I'm quoting their words, undertake a comprehensive study regarding Canada's bail system, and to table a report in the House with its recommendations. And again, the wording troubled me a little bit. The committee said, in order to answer the call for immediate action from all 13 premiers, and they have wordings like unanimously urge the strengthening of Canada's bail system. They throw in coded language, I think, about Canada's heroic first responders. So the committee undertook to do this largely in response to the Premier's letter and the public response to the very tragic death of the young police officer in Hagersville, Ontario, and the individual who was on bail at the time. Actually, he was unlawfully at large at the time. He had been granted release, but had failed to show up. And there was a warrant outstanding for him, which had not been served. But just all to point out that on January 30th, the language that the committee started off with this was fairly loaded, referencing the Premier's unanimous letter to the Prime Minister. So there's now been a total of 7 meetings on the study of bail. There have been 5 briefs and 30 witnesses. I have to say there's been a fairly full range of witnesses. I've referred to a couple of a good brief last time that we talked about this, but there's also been the Canadian Bar Association, Criminal Lawyers Association, but also they seem to have somewhat of a balance, and I'm happy to see that. Although I will say that one of the witnesses was the Attorney General of Saskatchewan, and it's a bit unusual to have provincial AGs appear in federal parliamentary committees. And of course, the commissioner of the OPP, who was the first off the mark with the death of an OPP officer, but calling for immediate, more stringent bail conditions. So anyway, the committee heard from all of these witnesses. You can, I have links I can share with you if you want, but you can have access to their briefs and the witnesses on their website. It would take for a long time to go through all of it. And of course, the whole area of bail reform is a very active one. And there are 2 items in this past Sunday's newsletter, a very excellent piece from Kent Roach and Cheryl Webster on quick and expedient reform that doesn't really secure public safety. So you can have a look at a couple of good pieces on that in the newsletter. It's all of this is there's quite a push and urgency for some reason. Well, for some reason, there's been a lot of political pressure, and the Minister of Justice has promised to introduce something in the near future. There's been a lot of talk about reverse onus provisions. My guess is the Minister of Justice will table something just before the House rises, probably in June. It's a difficult issue. It's a difficult issue to make evidence-based effective reform, particularly in a climate of such public outcry and emotion. So at its March 29 meeting, the committee gave drafting instructions to their analysts for a draft report. As soon as I see that, I will pull it out and circulate it, send it to Miles, and we'll try and make that available to everyone. So again, we'll have to see how the committee comes out on that. I think they're trying to table a report before the minister tables a bill. I'm sure they hope that their report would have some influence on Justice Canada's proposed bill amendments, but I can tell you this is a process that's been going on for a fair while in Justice, and we'll have to wait and see what comes out of that. The other 2 things I wanted to mention is the committee agreed to study Bill C-41. Miles, you've already referred to this very unusual piece of legislation, and you may want to chat about it again. But the committee is giving this tremendous speed and priority. They're going to be looking at C-41 at their upcoming meetings of April 17 and 19 with a clause-by-clause review, which is their last process to take place on April 24. So again, clause by clause is where they consider and pass each clause of the bill. So they plan to be done on April 24th with this C-41. It seems to be moving quite quickly. Miles, you've already mentioned this. It's an interesting mechanism because as it currently stands, NGOs in Afghanistan could be charged under the criminal code for supporting terrorist activity because they're supporting the Afghan government, which is a terrorist government. So there's been some move to develop this mechanism. And oddly enough, it's a licensing mechanism that will be controlled by Public Safety Canada. So people can apply for a license or to funding to be channeled. Anyway, it's a very interesting technical piece. It's sort of, I think it needs a fair bit of review to understand it. That I haven't been able to do that, but it's the committee is trying to move it quite quickly. The last thing I want to mention is that as part of its April 24th meeting and April 26th, if necessary, the committee has indicated that they will be considering their draft report on the study of the extradition law reform. Now, I think part of the motivation for the committee to look at extradition law reform is the Diab case. Professor Hassan Diab, the sociology professor at Carleton, who was extradited on what can only be considered the flimsiest of evidence to France. He was in custody for 3 years in France, most of which was in solitary confinement. Two of the judges in France indicated that there was no credible evidence on which to hold Diab, and they released him, and he came back home. The French Court of Appeal overturned the two trial level, actually they're investigative judges because of the civil code system, a little bit different than ours. The Court of Appeal overturned it and has ordered a trial, which is going on right now in absentia. Diab is not there. They haven't demanded his return at this point. He has a full defense team in France representing him. So that trial is ongoing, and we'll have to see what the result is. But a Canadian judge, Superior Court Judge Robert Méranger, has indicated that the evidence was of the flimsiest nature, and two judges in Paris, in France, have dropped the charges against him and said that there was no credible evidence on which to try him. There's been a lot of press material. There's some press response here. Rob Curry and Alex Nev did a very nice piece, which I put in the newsletter. There's a lot of media reports over there as well. So we'll have to see how that happens, but how it goes on. But I'm very curious to see what the Standing Committee comes up with in its report on extradition law. They were given some very good expert evidence by Department of Justice people about the extradition process and its checks and balances, most of which are political in nature, but many of which are not known broadly in Canada. But the Diab case has really shone a light on it. And I suspect that's the motivating factor for their study, but I'm curious to see what their report looks like when they decide to release it. So anyway, stay tuned on all of those things. That's all for me.
All right, I think I believe the prosecutor in France called Hassan Diab a coward or something for not showing up, which I find very rich considering they don't extradite their own citizens either.
No, it's astounding to me. Actually, Irving has been sharing with me some of the media reports from over there. One of the media reports stated the position that whether Diab is guilty or innocent, they should put him on trial because they need a public spectacle to clear this.
Yeah.
In our country, we don't put people on trial unless there's sufficient evidence. I mean, even the Crown in our country is subject to the reasonable prospect of conviction, pre-charge screening. That evidence, as Judge Méranger said in Canada, was nowhere near enough to pass that threshold. And it's only the low threshold of the Extradition Act that allowed for his extradition to a judicial system in France that the two investigating judges said they actually corroborated his alibi, that he was not in the country at the time. And they said there is no credible evidence for him to go to trial. So how they can put him to the trauma of a trial again, but they are doing so. And sometimes trials certainly clear the air publicly, but that's a lot of pressure to put on one individual. But thanks, Brendan. Yeah, no, it's Alex Nev and Rob Curry, who are experts in this area, describe it as Kafka-esque. I think that's a fair comment on this process.
It is fair. Thank you, Howard. Okay, so the next is public safety, national security. Rob isn't here. He did send me a note. He has nothing to add at this meeting for that particular committee. So we'll move on then to the Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs. So Brendan, you're up.
Yeah, so I actually have 2 months worth of reports for you guys. I'll try to keep it quick though. So basically since between I guess the February meeting and the March meeting, the committee met 5 times, and again in the last month since we met, it was another 4 times. Yeah, another 4 times. So there's been quite a bit of activity. The first 5 meetings, so the ones from February to March, were all on the topic of Bill S-212, which is Senator Pate's bill, around record expungements and whatnot. So the idea is to create a system of automatic record suspensions. There were a lot of witnesses for this bill. So there's various lawyers associations, RCMP, chiefs of police, the Parole Board, Public Safety, John Howard and the CCLA reported as well. I believe Ben Roebuck, the ombudsperson for victims of crime, also testified. Support was nearly unanimous for automatic suspension, but the concern, and this, I suppose the devil's in the details, it's which offenses would be included or excluded, what are the waiting periods, who's responsible for the system. So it seems like it's high level. Yes, we kind of all agree that there should be automatic suspensions for some people, but there's a lot of disagreement on who, what, when, where, and how. So notably, it's the third iteration of this bill. So the idea is, of course, it removes barriers, increase social reintegration, removing harms, particularly for disadvantaged groups who struggle currently to obtain record suspensions. So of course, as I was mentioning, there's concerns should the record suspension time be 3 years, should it be 5 years, should we be moving them? Because of course, as we all know, they changed under Harper, then I believe they're changed back under Trudeau to 3 years. I can't remember them off the top of my head right now. I'm sorry, but currently they're less restrictive than they were under Harper. So some bodies are saying that the record suspension should only be for summary summary offenses, not for indictable. There's some concerns, and this kept coming up about the safety. Well, what if we expunge the record of a sex offender and they just go out like that? Despite that question keep coming up, I believe Senator Payton, her bill expressly excluded sexual offenses from automatic record suspension. So it's weird that question kept coming up, but the bill is apparently like very explicit that those would not receive record automatic suspensions. One thing that I found a little concerning, and I'll bring that up because I think that's a little more of the important part. There was one witness, he was an ex-parole board chair. He was actually not very in favor of the automatic record suspensions because he was saying, oh, that's a one-size-fits-all approach, and so we shouldn't be automatically expunging records. And he was suggesting, and I was happy that one of the senators actually pushed the witness on this, but the witness was suggesting that part of the benefit of requiring an explicit process where the onus is on the individual is that's sort of the punishment. It's sort of like a test. Like, do you really want this? Then come do it. So it was kind of like a screening effect. It's supposed to have a bit of a screening effect because only those who truly want the expungement and are deserving of the expungement will actually go through the whole rigmarole, which I found a little concerning in all honesty, particularly from the ex-chair of the parole board. The last name was Blackburn. I can't remember his first name. So of course, concerns about safety, should we be doing this? Police were concerned about, especially when it comes to intimate partner violence, that if records were expunged automatically, then they'd no longer be able to warn witnesses. But even then, like I said, police were generally in favor of automatic suspensions. Interestingly, I believe it was the Minister of Public Safety, or at least some representatives came to speak about this bill, saying that, again, they're in favor of the idea, but they don't like the implementation as outlined in this act, and that they're currently wrapping up consultations, or that they had undergone consultations and are currently working on a bill. Senators were concerned when they couldn't get a firm date on when it or if any of this bill would come to fruition. But like I said, the government was sort of suggesting wait for our bill, and that's what will pass. Unsurprising. So that's the main issues I'd say on Senator Pate's bill and the update from last month. This month, however, so in the last 4 meetings, the committee had they tabled a report on the involuntary intoxication bill that was passed in the summer. I've been unable to obtain that report. Of course, I think I'm not going to go over those concerns too much because I believe we've discussed them. They've been discussed with the Commons Committee and also in the Senate. I will let you know as soon as that report is available to me, though. So 3 of the 4 meetings since our last PRC meeting was on the discussion of Bill C9, which is an act to amend the Judges Act. Essentially, the bill is meant to put in place a streamlined process of addressing complaints against federally appointed judicial officers. The bill is intended to streamline the complaint process, provide greater layperson involvement. It allows for sanctions below the removal from the bench because, as I understand, currently the only decision that the Judicial Council, I believe the Judicial Council, can recommend is Does this rise to the need to remove from the bench or not? Now there's going to be more options to sanction in other ways that does not involve removing from the bench. And I think that just one slightly minor issues. I believe that the funding for these hearings would come directly from the Treasury Board as opposed to an individual ministry. I believe that sort of takes some of the political nature and the budgeting questions out. I wasn't entirely sure on how that all worked, but that was the impression I got. So most major stakeholders, lawyers associations, judges associations, the ombudsperson for the victims of crime, most of them are on board with these changes. Apparently these consultations have been ongoing for several years. I believe they said since 2016. There are some concerns and there are some differences in opinion between all these groups. However, the Minister of Justice who reported was saying that the parties are in agreement that they don't want to reopen discussions for what they see as minor points. They really want to see the change happen quickly to this new process. I would note just two perhaps controversial issues that were the large that took the majority of the committee's time. There's a stipulation in the bill about attempting to make these review committees representative of Canada's diversity as much as possible. There are some that didn't like that qualifier, saying, "Oh, it's just sort of an escape route to say, oh, we did our best, and we're not actually going to try to make these committees diverse." But of course, since these review committees that will review complaints are going to be small, some were concerned that can we really even achieve that much diversity when you have 5 people? That diversity reflecting Canada's diversity with 5 single people, debatable. The other concern was this bill does not allow for review by the federal court of appeal. So what this bill does, the structure would be that it would essentially the concern was that the Judicial Council would be vetting request, would be investigating request, and deciding judgment, and essentially they would there's no external oversight in the bill. Apparently appeals can go to the Supreme Court of Canada, but of course they don't take many appeals, and it has to be of a national interest. So many were fearful that the complaints arising, any appeal that would arise out of this new review process would not rise to the level of national concern, and as such would be unsuccessful in appealing to the Supreme Court. So individuals were saying that actually we should allow for one final appeal at the Federal Court of Appeal to have outside to have external oversight. However, the main distinction here is currently in the review process, apparently complaints, there can be intermediary appeals during the complaints process, and that's what slows things down. And that's sort of one of the points of this bill is to resolve complaints more quickly and efficiently. So what was suggested by, I believe, I can't remember who presented it. It was a lawyers association. I apologize. There's many of them, but the main point was that it was only a final decision could be appealed. There could not be intermediary appeals or interlocutory, I believe is the word they used. So that would balance having some right of appeal, but also keeping efficiency in mind. And so that was the last point. I believe they're still discussing this bill, and so there's been no change since. I expect they will be moving to clause by clause shortly, but there's no future meetings currently on the agenda.
Thanks, Brendan. That's very comprehensive. Are there any questions for Brendan, or in fact for Howard and his report? The next committee report is the Senate Committee on Human Rights. That's mine. I apologize. I couldn't get to it in the last month. This is a really, really tight time during the semester, so I apologize for that. So I'll certainly incorporate the meetings in this last month with the meetings in the upcoming month for our next PRC. Okay, moving on. So other items of business arising. There's really nothing new other than just to say that I presume, Peter, you're still on the list for the facial recognition report, and you and Lynn were working on that, and I presume there's nothing yet for our consumption.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. And likewise for myself,
Yes.
I'm sorry, Peter. Oh, okay. My apologies.
Carry on. I just said yes. You were correct.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. And I haven't done anything further with respect to the human rights codes across the country. regarding discrimination relative to criminal records. I will get to that before the next meeting, so I apologize for the delay. That takes us then now to bills under consideration. So in the Commons, not much has been happening other than Bill C-40, which is the Miscarriage of Justice Commission bill. It's at second reading. And then Bill C-41, which Howard made reference to, dealing with funding and terrorism. It had second reading on March 27th. There was no change for any private members bill in the Commons except 291, which basically deals with child pornography. So it's at second reading. Senate, there are no government bills to discuss, and private member bills. Likewise, there's been no change since the last meeting. So not a lot of movement on bills. So that brings us up to date. Does anybody have anything else you want to bring forward for the good of the PRC? Very good. All right, guys, thank you very much. So we have our jobs cut out for us for next meeting, which will take place on May the 9th. All right, thank you kindly. Peter, you're going to get me the amended agenda, the amended minutes. I'll circulate that, and then we're good to go. So thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Miles.
Bye.
Miles.
Bye.
Miles.